and welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we will continue our discussion on Running by Natalia Sylvester. Last episode, we discussed our favorite moments from the first half. This episode, we will focus on the second half of the novel.
All right. So we just released the first half of our discussion, and so we're hoping to finish the novel today. We have a lot of passages to get through, and if you readers and listeners are keeping up with our pace, we left off in a critical juncture where, it kind of represents the first major conflict for our protagonist, where, she was presumed missing. And of course, we all knew where she was. But on page 118, kind of represents the first point where she begins to see her father in a different light, if you ask me. And it says, so she turned out to be with Gloria and Amaris. And then she says, Gloria says, or she says, no, does my father know about you two? Like there's something wrong with them. And he never asked, so I never told him. Of course, Amaris didn't want me working for him, I nod, remembering what my father used to say before gay marriage became legal. That marriage was a holy thing between a man and a woman. He hasn't talked about it in years. Gloria would hide it. He's always saying he doesn't care what people do with their lives so long as they don't do it in front of him. And then at the bottom, she says, I feel the part of me that has always been made excuses for him began to sink into a pool of shame. Not caring isn't the same as supporting someone. Not seeing is the opposite of accepting them. And then she says, I'm sorry. So I thought that was really important. She finds out something about Gloria that is personal and, as we come to find later, presents a problem for her dad because of his campaign, but also because more broadly, just his own political views, as she says there. So I just thought that was really important. And it is kind of emblematic of homophobia within the Latinx and Hispanic community that unfortunately, I think it's more common within older generations than it is within the younger generation.
Right. And you hear that often used phrase like, I don't care, but just don't do it in front of me or whatever. It's there's always something. But you're right. There is an interesting relationship there, and I think it's really nice how Mari befriends them, especially Amaris, when she comes in this time of need. And in the last episode, we spent a lot of time talking about the media, maybe not probably this is today as well, but obviously their relationship kind of gets exposed in a way. Like it never really dives into it, but obviously it's a point of contention too. So
what did you think about that, Vanessa? That how he seems not to have a problem with it personally, but of course, like within his own family, and I think especially, of course, within his political campaign, it's just not something he would support.
I think it's interesting the way that it plays out later, like for everyone involved, specifically focusing on Amaris and Gloria's relationship. Like not about everything, but like focusing on that, like the way that it turns out for everyone is really interesting.
Yeah, so if you have a passage about that, we can get to it later. I don't know if you did, but yeah, I did want to shine a light on that. It is an important issue that, thanks to the Supreme Court, I think it was last decade, gay marriage is legal, but for the longest time it hasn't been. And still largely, of course, there's a lot of discrimination against the LGBTQIA community. And I think it's really interesting how she kind of, like I had said, is exposed to these kinds of different worldviews and ways of being that, again, they're trying to put her in that bubble, right?
Hmm.
But, she just keeps finding ways to learn about different views.
Yeah.
And it continues here with, I think, the passage that you're going to cover, Richie.
Did you have 134 though? Because
Yes, I
yeah,
do.
just before, because I
Okay.
I love Poder, but before that, I think you have a passage that you really like.
Yeah. Well, it kind of ties into all of this. So as Mariana's starting to like figure out and starting to question things a little bit more, Jackie comes in to defend her, and she's like, "You don't even like me." And then Jackie's confused, and she says that it's based off of all the things that she wrote about her father is why she wouldn't like her. And then Jackie corrects her, and she's like, "But you're not him," by saying, "Are you your father?" So it's interesting that, well, I like that because Mariana seeing that she's able to see things differently than her father now. And people aren't necessarily like grouping them together just because they're family and he's running for president.
Yeah, it's a key moment, and I like it too. This is a nice shift because up to this point, based on what we know through Madi, she feels that Jackie's antagonizing her, and a lot of that's because she feels defensive for her father, right? And again, she doesn't really know just yet, like why people are critical of him. But then you have this where moment where Jackie defends her, and so it starts to become a little bit more clear for her. That's a beautiful response, right? Are you your father? It's like the whole sins of the father
Mm-hmm.
thing, right? And
Mm-hmm.
like directly right there. Um, and so I love the transition from 16 to 17 because Jackie, the last line of chapter 16. Jackie laughs and smacks open the door again. Come on, I want to show you something. It's so inviting, right? And so in chapter 17, we learn about this student club organization called Poder. And obviously, we've talked about this in past episodes, but in the context of literary sponsors. But we learned that one of the teachers, Miss Sepulveda, found a space that hadn't been used, right? Because they had built a new auditorium, so it was like, and so she found the space for students pretty much. Well, Jackie got suspended at the beginning of the year. We had talked about that, I think, last episode for pretty much, I guess, drawing attention, trying to like raise awareness on a variety of issues. And she got suspended. And so they created this room. And so when she brings it here, um, you know, I love the description of the space. Definitely worth checking out. If you guys have read it, you understand. If not, definitely, that part's pretty cool to me because you get a lot of sense of the things they're fighting for, right? And obviously, I think there are more progressive causes. And so I like the dialogue that's kind of early on in the room where Mari, or yeah, Jackie says it's our center of operations. And Mari, right, this is the space they gave you for your protest club. That's almost like her father speaking through her,
Mm-hmm.
because it almost has a negative connotation. I've seen people use this negative connotation,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so Jackie clarifies activist group. Though we do protest sometimes, it's not a bad word, You don't have to whisper it, Mariana. Yeah, I love that dialogue because it's kind of clarifying an important issue. I feel like too many people are, I don't know, these times, there's been a lot of protests. I've seen a lot of criticism. And I just think, again, I can't say this enough. I said it so many times last episode, but shout out to these young activists trying to change the place for better, according to them. And finally, of course, so she meets all the characters, all the other friends there that are involved with the club, like Didier and Christina. And I think probably one of my favorite parts is, let's see, kind of lost it there. Oh yeah, yeah. On page 141, she's still kind of looking at around the room. Adi is still looking around the room. And it's the middle of the page, and she says it's Poppy's version of a nightmare. So I think she recognizes, and she already knows that he's not gonna appreciate that he's hanging out with Jackie,
Yeah.
and so But I really love this club, and like I think we mentioned before, Jackie's probably my favorite character too, and I just think the fact that she's so welcoming too to
Mm-hmm.
Mari, because she could easily just lump her in with her dad and think, but instead she's open and she sees potential in her that, hey, you have a voice, you have power, especially now because of your dad. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
it's going from there.
Yeah, I mean, Jackie shows a level of maturity that, um, you know, is just makes this whole encounter very interesting. And in that passage you read about how it's Papi's version of a nightmare, I like how it ends. They think Jackie goes looking for trouble, and I added there good trouble, because that's what John Lewis, who passed away,
And
you know,
Kamala even mentioned it too in her
yeah.
acceptance.
Um, and then, we find out also what Poder stands for: people against oppression, demanding equality, and resisting, right? So it's actually an acronym.
I always love that, one of those reverse acronyms where you're like trying to fit in. Oh, that goes.
Yeah. um, and I think it also shows the importance of those kinds of safe spaces and activist spaces within academia and within also like youth organizations, because there are spaces where like, there could be helicopter advisors who are just kind of, don't make you feel comfortable. But then with this space, they clearly are allowed to be who they are. They have this little free library where they can check books out. So it kind of reminds me a little bit of Papagayo, because of all the art supplies there too. Um, but I don't know what you thought about the space, Vanessa, and like how, you know, like I said, like Richie had said, and we talked about last time, that Jackie kind of seemed like she was going to be the antagonist.
I like that she's there to help Mariana when she's struggling.
Mm-hmm.
And she kind of shows her this space where she's able to express herself. So I really like that she turns out to not be someone who's against her, but someone that's trying to inform her of all the different things that are going on,
Mm-hmm.
especially in their community.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's not like she's being pressured either necessarily. I don't, because Jackie is very much aware of like, well, if you don't feel comfortable doing this, you don't have to. And I think that's very important with whenever someone is new, is like, you don't want to force them to do something because it's not going to be genuine, and they're going to feel like their heart is not in it. But Jackie is very much aware of that.
I think especially because she's so politically aware that she knows where her father's stance is.
Mm-hmm.
So she's not necessarily trying to push her or like pull her onto her side, but she's trying to just inform her like these are the things that we're fighting for.
Right. Yeah, because it's not necessarily just because she's the daughter, and kind of goes back to the passage you talked about, that she's the daughter, yes, but she's still her own person. So she's not really targeting her because of that, or really targeting her at all. Did you have something a little after that?
I have on 145.
Okay, I had something just a little later. So, what happens here?
So this is when Mariana gets home after her pictures have been published on different blogs. And earlier she does mention that her parents are going to blame her for everything that happened. And so she gets home, and that's basically what happens.
To the listeners who haven't read it, though, what pictures should they know about?
So Mariana and her friend Vivi are laying out in the backyard. They're laying out in the backyard tanning, so they're in like their swimsuits, and they want like an even tan, so they take off the straps. And a drone comes up into the backyard and takes pictures.
And then that's when it goes viral, right? That
The blog posted it.
they
Yes.
scandalize it,
Mm-hmm.
make it seem like they're nude,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Last episode you talked about like how we celebritize things, and
Yes.
that's kind of one of the dark sides, that whole paparazzi mentality and
Yeah.
the tendency to like get the scoop, even if it's at the behest of someone's privacy.
Yeah. And so the part that I wanted to talk about was on 145, and it's her and her mom are talking. I believe they're talking on the phone. And so her mom tells her that her father is hurt, that she was so thoughtless, even though she was in her own backyard. And so Mariana's response is, he's hurt? Did he ever bother asking how I feel? Did you? And so she's kind of like really offended that they're not even trying to see it like she wasn't doing anything wrong.
I'm offended like, reading that section. What?
Yeah. And then I guess in 148 it kind of comes full circle, like this is where he puts out a statement, issues an answer to a reporter where she says he calls him out that it was nefarious behavior of them, that those responsible should be ashamed, he says, along with the blogs that published him and putting my child. This is truly a new, unimaginable low. My family is hurt. We ask that you respect our privacy for our own children's protection, to no longer have them joining us for any events where press will be present. Thank you. What I wanted to highlight here was she italicizes the part where he had said, perfectly normal for a teenager like herself. And then she says, I hear them in someone else's voice. I can't recognize him in them. And I think, because that's what he opened with, is that these pictures were manipulated to make it appear as something perfectly normal for a teenager like herself was more nefarious. Is that she's beginning to realize that he has this political persona, that's not who he is, and so it kind of starts creating more distance between them and showing that he's not really seems to be there for her. He's just really doing this for the campaign. Because of course, as you mentioned, Vanessa, that he was upset about this, right?
Mm-hmm.
But here, I mean, he doesn't seem that way.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you have several instances, right, where you have, it's almost like a crossroad for him, right? The campaign or his daughter. When she disappears, right? He chooses the campaign, right? Like, we'll do the interview and pretend it's nothing, just kind of pretend nothing's happening, she's not missing, and then of course in this situation, right, where they're more concerned about the public image versus how she feels being violated in their own backyard,
right?
Like they're and so through this book, it's interesting analyzing the way, of course, media and media cycles work, and so I don't know if you have one before it, but my next point is on the beginning of chapter 19, 149, the first paragraph.
I just wanted to add one more line from 148 where kind of like ties into everything that we've been talking about.
Cool.
So it's towards the bottom of the page, and it says, I can't believe this is what it took for Papi to listen to me. What I wanted never mattered unless it could somehow help him. So I think that's really important, like in having witnessed like how he responded to it with her and how he responded to it with the press. And I also think that he handles it that way with her because he looks at it like, now I have to handle this with everyone else, rather than like, this is a family thing, like we need to deal with it. He's like, how do I turn this around?
Yeah, it's more of like an annoyance, like,
yeah, like you're getting in the way of me winning this thing.
Yeah,
that's unfortunate. Yeah. So I wanted to point it out. I think a pretty cool paragraph from Natalia. I just think the way she takes high school is kind of a microcosm for just what will turn into adult life. And so, using this situation um, of backlash, right, and bad press, her parents decide that it's best for her to stay home, right, from school the next day. And so the paragraph goes, Mommy says it's so that things can calm down and that hopefully students will have fresh gossip by Wednesday. It makes me think of how Papi always says to wait a day when things are looking bad. There's usually something else coming up in the news cycle, and people's attention spans can only handle so much. I wonder if we ever really grow out of it, if all of life is just an endless chain of chisme. And maybe all I have to look forward to when I graduate is a grown up version of high school with higher stakes and higher ratings. I just I put 5 stars next to that paragraph. Like, okay, yes, I hear that. I hear that. Like, that's a pretty interesting way of taking the book and kind of making a broader statement in a powerful way from Sylvester.
Mm-hmm.
The endless chain of chisme, or as my friend likes to say, the chisme industrial complex. And it's true. We do tend to, I hate to say it, but in a way, there's news cycles.
Mm-hmm.
And it's unfortunate because, oftentimes there's important stuff that comes out in these cycles, but people care about it for just those moments and then move on to the next thing. And it's a little cynical, but as we learn here, it doesn't have to be that way in the book.
Yeah. And she can kind of come off as jaded to the reader here, but I think, it is part of becoming more mature that your world does open up to kind of how people can betray you, how the world can betray you, um, and how it does seem like you are being targeted, because she really is, right? Like, you know, drones themselves are so problematic, right? I mean, in warfare and also within the private community. I don't know about y'all, but I've seen them like at protests, and you always wonder, like, who is it, Is it like the government or is it like some random citizen? And there's been concern about protesters being photographed, but thankfully masks do help. But
Yeah, I mean, so reading this in the light of this pandemic and Black Lives Matter movement, and yeah, super interesting. And of course, the pandemic, wearing the masks, right? Because that is an issue. And all of the calls for marches for justice, protests. Oftentimes that's something that has to be added now in the copy is make sure to keep your face protected because you don't know how people are going to use your images.
and some people there could be undercover too. So yeah. What else did you have, Vanessa, in that chapter or area?
Well, my next one's on 161.
Okay.
It kind of ties into something that you had said earlier, Richie, and it's like how she describes things. So this is when she's describing the furniture that she can see in the garage. The beige flower patterned couch where we used to watch movies on weekends until we passed out. The baby piano Vivi never learned to play anything on other than row, row, row your boat. And so I really like the way that, like, it's a really short part, but she ties memories to these things. And so I really like the way that that's used as like a way to describe these things.
This is actually looking at her and Vivi, right? Because her parents they have a breakup. It's not, and her father pretty much just throws everything away.
Yeah.
That's what kind of, so she's looking at the stuff there, and that's painful to look at things like that have these memories attached and just see them discarded in that way.
It reminds me of that story in Everything Begins and Ends, if you all remember, where he had the kid had a photograph, and he was trying to find out like what bar was it where their parents met. Kind of reminds me of that, of the memories of photographs and things that you see. What did you all have for the part here where it goes into the environmental issue related to the aquifer? The next few chapters, like 22 and so forth.
Well, I had 176.
Me too.
At 166.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
just really quick, I guess, if you as you guys transition to that,
Yeah.
because here again, she's becoming more active with Jackie and Boded, and I just love her thoughts as she already mentioned being in the room how like it's the worst his worst nightmare, but of course now she invites him over to their house, and again it's just telling of the father. This is the bottom of page 166 where she says, "Whatever this is, Papi would kill me if he knew I invited Jackie Velez over. He's convinced she's what's wrong with kids these days, not drugs or teen pregnancies or violence, but their radical ideals." And I keep harping on it because it comes up, but you do have the tendency to see adults, people in power, positions of power, belittle kids with ideas. Like, oh, you just don't understand.
Right.
You don't know the world yet, but that's so dismissive, and I think that's again at the crux of this entire book and Mari's journey. Throughout the entire book.
Mm-hmm. And the word radical itself is kind of used as a pejorative a lot,
Just like protest, right?
Yeah. But yeah, I think you and I, Vanessa, had the same one, right?
Probably.
Yeah, where she finds out about her father.
Yes.
And just to give some context to the listeners, so it turns out that there's contamination going on in Miami-Dade in the aquifers. And it's similar to what's going on in Flint. And in fact, they mentioned that. It's seeping into the property. There, like schools, have to, and even like there's a passage where like church, even in church, you have to boil the water. So it's pretty nasty. And what was that passage, Vanessa, here with Jackie?
Okay. So Jackie's talking to Mariana. She says, "Your father's the one who sponsored the bill. When he was state senator, it was his idea to allow sewage water into the aquifer. And the property where all the water testing came back contaminated this week. The developer, he was pushing for the bill too. It was Harrison Irving."
Yeah, so we find out Harrison is a lobbyist for her dad. Why did you highlight this one though, Vanessa?
Oh, because I was reading it and I was like, oh my gosh, this is it's like such a turning point, because you find out like he says he's doing all of these things with her, like going to the beach and cleaning it up.
Mm-hmm.
But he's turning around and signing bills that do stuff that are allowing this contamination.
And she's mentioned Harrison Irving before, so it's just we also have that name recognition, and in a way we feel all together that oof.
Yeah.
Mariana, oof.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a contrasting image when what we saw about him in the Everglades, where he really did seem environmentally conscious. So it does come as quite a shock, of course. And of course, there's the irony that Jackie knows this, but his own daughter doesn't. So that's kind of part of the impetus for her to kind of start being more involved with Jackie. So they start thinking about a walkout, and we've had a walkout before, if you all remember, in Hate You Give. So it's kind of similar here, because it's also in the name of protesting, right? It's not just to like ditch school or anything, like Haley would think. But what did you all have around this area, like in the 180s and 190s?
I have 183.
Me too.
I think we all have the same passages, honestly. Yeah.
Mine's towards the middle of the page.
Yeah.
What? Everybody?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
wait, is yours okay? Go ahead.
No, yeah, that just to give context. So, Mari's finding out more and more about her father. Not just his involvement and being the one who sponsored this bill that created this mess with, polluting the water, but also when it comes to immigration. So, what was it here?
Oh, well, the line that I underlined was where she tells her, Amaris tells her that her dad has one of the lowest attendance records in the Senate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He's voted against reform, but then he's like, other times he just doesn't show up.
Yeah.
I don't even understand how that's a thing that they can do. That doesn't make any sense to me.
And it doesn't make sense to her, right? Because she says that's impossible. He's never home. He's always in DC, right? So like, what's he going to be doing? But I also wanted to mention that right before that, like you mentioned, Richie, when it comes to immigration, that he's voted against it, right? And that kind of also comes off as a shock to her because he's talked, we talked about it in part one, that, he feels proud as a Cuban immigrant, but not as a refugee, right? Because that's a dirty word to them. So I don't know if you had anything to add.
It's all about framing, in that regard. Yeah, I mean, so speaking of like immigration reform, again, we've been talking about experience and meeting new people, and so you have these other members of Poder, Christina or Chrissy. She's Peruvian, and they mentioned not. I think it was just a little bit before this.
Mm-hmm.
That her brother was deported, but he was a veteran. He served, but he was still deported. So this is something that I don't think Mariana has had a chance to connect with real life people until now. And so, of course, these conversations come up, and it's all coming to light to her.
And it really shows you the injustices present in the immigration system. That I can tell you secondhand that these kinds of things, still happen, and it's quite common actually. That you would think being a veteran would somehow stop you from getting deported, but it doesn't.
Well, you have the way that chapter ends is Amadeus pretty much telling her you have to choose a side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that crosswords that you mentioned for her, not just for her father. And then my next one was until 204. I don't know about you all.
Mine was 188.
Is it about Ricky?
Yes. That's such a good line.
Go for it.
So this kind of ties back into something that we talked about in the second episode, the first half of the book, about how they don't talk about policies or anything in the house, and they kind of shelter the kids from that. So this is Mariana talking about her little brother Ricky, and she says, "I used to think it was sweet that he was so sheltered, but the world's gonna hit him hard someday." So I think it's really important because he only knows his little world, and so did Mariana until just recently. And she's like, if I'm going through this now, I can't even imagine what it's going to be like for him when he starts to realize these things.
Yeah, and from a parenting standpoint, I think we've talked about this, that I guess you kind of can understand why they would want to shelter to some degree, like protect them from, the evils of the world, right? But of course, like you said, Vanessa, and like she says there, right, that reality is going to hit him hard. And I think that could maybe even be more pernicious because it could cause even more trauma.
Yeah, in this section, right, he asks Gloria, well, who helps you, who takes care of you and your stuff? And he said, well, I do. And she said, it's okay because mine is even a quarter the size of this one, like her space. And the way Natalia writes it, Ricky practically got whiplash from the shock. So you're right. It's gonna be interesting as he gets older, maybe, and starts to realize the world isn't as he knows.
Yeah. What was your next one, Vanessa?
204.
Okay, same for me. Was it the one about church and like that big paragraph?
It's the end of that paragraph.
Yeah, same for me.
Same.
What?
Yeah.
You guys are liars.
Look.
Yeah, look. So, I had mentioned this earlier that they have to boil the water for the Eucharist, it turns out, because it's now affecting, the church here. And then she says, I guess even the body of Christ isn't immune to whatever chemicals are in our water right now. um, and before the service started, uh, it was full of people waiting to get a case of bottled water, and Papi donated several cases. And then I think you had the end of that, right, Vanessa?
Yeah. So it says, all I could think about was these plastic bottles ending up back in the ocean once they're thrown away. It's like we're incapable of solving one problem without creating another. I don't even know what to say. I feel like that says it all. And I think this is something that I'm really big on. I think. And I think something that we can also relate it to now is the masks and how many people just throw them on the ground when they're done.
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah.
And so I really tied that to what's going on now, especially now it's both of them. Now it's the plastic bottles and the masks, and I don't understand why people do that.
Yeah.
It's a pretty powerful statement,
Yeah,
right? And sometimes it's frustrating when trying to make changes. You're conscious of what you're doing with, it's here. It's hard to solve one problem without creating another. You have to be really aware of how our actions affect other things and other people.
Yeah.
And it shows how much she has matured by now, that she's able to pick up, because normally you might not think much of water bottles, right? But she's able to see that line of distribution and disposal where it is going to end up, because it is plastic, right? It's not reusable. So she's very environmentally conscious at this point. So in many ways, she is showing more maturity than her dad, because to her dad, I think because the camera is there, he's really more doing as a kind of spectacle, right? It's what they call the photo op, but to her, she realizes do we really need to give away, plastic bottles, right? And why not just I don't know, disposable cups that you can actually recycle. So yeah, I mean, it's just really interesting how she ties in that chain reaction of environmental problems.
Yeah, you get her sense of growing frustration. I don't know if you guys have anything on 206, because I have a couple parts highlighted there, because it covers a lot of, again, how she's realizing how her dad thinks and operates, starting with he wants to congregate with people after, or he wants to meet with people after the congregation and talk to people. And as she observes him, Poppy waves one more time, looking flattered. I wonder what it must be like to live in his head, constantly creating your own reality and having enough people in your life play along. There's a lot of interesting processes going through here. And you have these inner thoughts, right? Later on in the page, middle of the page, the italicized part where she's kind of just thinking to herself. Making people feel like you're listening isn't the same thing as listening, I want to say. I'm scared the truth will hurt him, so I keep quiet and let it hurt me instead. That's a big oof moment for me.
Yeah.
Oh man, she's starting to think about, oh man, the drums are in play now.
Yeah, I think we were talking about this last time, right? That the way that his father is, he's really not listening to her. He's also seems to be not listening to his own constituents either, unless they have a lot of money, like this Harrison Irving dude. So it's very perceptive of her to kind of pick up on this quality, right? That he's pretending to be listening, right? But he's really not. And it's kind of good foreshadowing, of course, of what happens, or an interesting foreshadowing of what happens, at the end of the novel.
I think, the next one that I have ties into that one.
Oh, yeah?
But it's on 246. I don't know if you have something before that.
Yes, I did. It was 236.
Okay.
But we could go back to that one since it ties in.
So it's the paragraph towards the bottom of the page.
Mm-hmm.
So she's talking about Irving, And she says, the man responsible for leaving my best friend without a home and her abuela in the hospital. The man leaving entire neighborhoods without clean water. The man who basically finances my father and who my father would never cross. And so that's kind of ties into what you just said about how he doesn't really listen to anybody unless it's somebody who has money like Irving.
And it ends up affecting Vivi, right? And Vivi's dad. And so now it's almost practically personal, right? And then of course, it ends up affecting Gloria too. So all of these issues that I think can seem kind of abstract, right? Like environmental justice, now becomes something that is concrete. And then at the end of this, she says, Papi always, it's kind of funny how she kind of turns what he says against him. Papi always says, to create change, you need three things: people, purpose, and ganas. I have the first two, and Irving just gave me all the determination I need.
Yeah, I started that line.
Yeah, me too.
So we had tied that one in, Richie, because it tied in with the other one. But I just wanted to go back real quickly to 236. We talked about his position being kind of anti-immigration reform, which I will say, that there is, there used to be at least a fair consensus on immigration reform, even from Republicans on both, and of course, Democrats are the ones who are most in favor. So his position kind of seems even more far right than the average. And I just wanted to highlight the distinction that he tries to make between him and other kinds of immigrants. Here, talking to who is he talking? Who is she talking to? Is it?
It's
She's talking to
Didier?
Chrissy. Didier and Chrissy. Oh yeah, Didier.
Yeah. So she says he's a son of immigrants. He does care. And then they reply, yeah, but when his parents came over from Cuba, they got their green cards fast because they were political exiles because of Castro. And even up until a few years ago, Cuban refugees who touched land got to stay. Nobody did that for Haitians. We had dictators and coups too. We got on boats and risked drowning, and we still got sent back. You did? She says surprisingly. Not me, literally, Mari. I was born here. But how do I put this? You ever notice in your dad's speeches, he only says exiles, but immigrants when he's talking about refugees? So exiles when he's talking about your family, but immigrants when he's talking about refugees from Haiti. And so it kind of just shows again that, he has different view. He's able to kind of be cognitively dissonant about different immigration experiences, even though, to me, as someone who's an immigration activist, this is one of those examples where it's a difference that makes no difference. Because exile, refugee, and asylee are all just different technical ways of thinking about the same kind of immigrant, right? Someone who flees because of any different forms of persecution and is asking for a new home. But it's funny how he kind of turns that off, and gives that preferential treatment to people who are on his side of things, but people who are darker skinned, the Haitians, right, in this case, he considers to be second class people. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Because it's crazy how politicized the difference in terms can be, right, when people talk about it. And
yeah, and we've talked about it. I think we talked about it with Ben Saenz' book, because we had an undocumented immigrant in that one who got bullied and faced a hate crime because of it. And so later on, she ends up taking part in this demonstration, basically, with Jackie, where they end up, they're going to march to his right to his office, right? And at first she doesn't feel comfortable. But Vanessa, I don't know if you had a passage in between there. Mine didn't come up till 270.
Oh, my next one is like all of chapter 40.
Oh,
What page?
that's.
It's not that long.
Oh.
It's like 3 pages.
I have a 260.
I think specifically mine is 277 and 278.
Okay, so I guess you can go first, Richie.
Yeah, it's just a quick thing, and it actually reminds me of something that you say all the time, Jorge. Is about the personal being political. Right? The political is personal. The personal is political.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, they're talking about the protests, and she's reflecting on how her parents shield her from politics, and in this moment, she's becoming more, again, vigilant, right? Kind of becoming one of the de facto leaders of this march, this protest to her father's office. And she comes to the realization that if every part of our lives is a decision that someone is making for us, then everything is political, even doing nothing, even staying in this car. And so it's this moment of she has to make this choice, and her mom, tries to stop her. But then at some point we realize that her mom was pretty active at some point, we learn, and she kind of lost that. And so I think her mother empathizes with her at this moment and lets her go right out of the car. So
Yeah,
I liked that moment, that realization, right? Just because, like I said, it reminds me of something you say all the time, that the personal is political.
mm-hmm.
Too often people like to say, I don't like politics, or I don't want, but like it's our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Especially like she says here, if people are making decisions for us,
Yeah.
even doing nothing
Right.
is political.
And I think I'll just make a distinction, because I listened to Michelle Obama's speech, and she said, she doesn't like politics, right? But that's a different sense of usage of the term, where, the bickering and like the legislative process, the way that politicians kind of go after each other,
Partisanship, like it's a sports match.
Mm-hmm. And it can get really nasty, right? Especially with social media. There's a representative from California, Devin Nunes, who wants to sue someone because he uses a picture of a cow when he talks about him. But anyway, because he calls him Devin Nunes' cow is his username. But a little later on 270, and I think this is still before chapter 40, I think it's interesting how Jackie describes protests. She has really interesting ways of looking at things. Protest is not supposed to be convenient. Because it kind of reminds me of what's going on today, right? Where people said, wait, I got to get to work, right? Like there's a protest going on. Or like, I'm going to have to miss whatever. It's not like there's anything going on these days anyway. So it's just really interesting. And she ties it into Flint, of course, the government turning its back on the Black community there. And that all of that, is not convenient, right? So, and she says, our health is more important than your convenience. Our right to clean water is more important than any developer's profits. We're here to be heard. And so they start that chant, right, of and so I just thought that was a really powerful section, how to tie in drinking water, bottled water, to the human right to water, and the need to protest if you really want to make a change, because sometimes voting isn't enough. What about on chapter 40, Vanessa?
So this is the chapter where they finally arrive to her father's office. And he comes out of the office, he comes out of the building. And he kind of is giving just like this speech of how he's willing to listen, but he's talking over everybody, which is so annoying. But finally, Mariana yells at him, and he kind of is shocked. So I wanted to kind of read off what she says. She says, "You once told me that all the reasons to run for office, there's only one good one, to improve the lives of others. If that's still true, and I have to believe it is, deep down, then this is all real simple. There is no such thing as both sides when one side is drinking contaminated water and the other side is contaminating it. We don't need a debate. We need action. We need clean water. It's the most basic thing. It's biology. It's survival. What kind of society are we if we can't provide the people with this? And he kind of freezes, and he says, "You're right. I made you a promise. I intend to keep it." And then he walks away, which is really interesting because like he doesn't really say much else. Kind of just dismisses it and walks away. Like, okay, I said what I had to say, and now I'm done.
All the more surprising because, well, maybe not surprising, but important and salient because it's his own daughter, right? And he's on camera too. So yeah, it kind of shows that he is kind of taken aback by this, and maybe he is kind of finally realizing, right? It's finally getting through. You're gonna have to turn your back on your own family if you're gonna really stand up for profits over people.
Yeah, I mean it's a powerful moment, and I like a couple of passages just before it on 276 and 277. How you mentioned it right now, Vanessa, how he kind of takes up space and the way Mari describes it. His words begin running into one another in my mind. How can one person say so much without saying anything at all? It almost feels violent. He's taking up space so that we can't claim it. It's a very real thing that happens to people. I talked about the dismissive nature towards youth and activism, but you see it here, and kind of this shift, this moment where she does just before she decides to speak out. I think it's some beautiful prose from Natalia Sylvester, in the middle of page 277. And of course, it ties in with her name, Mari, the ocean, and so you have this kind of water imagery, and also, as you said earlier, Jorge, almost like the words of her father kind of against them, used against them, where she's kind of coming into her own. She says, I imagine all the tension and doubt and fear spilling out of it like water crashing ashore. I tell myself what Jackie said to let my voice flow through me, but then louder still I hear Papi's own words on the day he taught me how to swim in the ocean. I was so afraid the current would take me under. He told me not to be afraid. Swim with it, he said. Let it take you to safety. It's this cool moment of becoming, right? Just before she gives this speech to her dad on 40. Yeah, this is a great chapter. I see why you chose the whole one.
I was like,
right?
the whole thing.
Just read the whole chapter out loud. Yeah, but I love it. And then, of course, this recognition at the very end, like, I heard you speak. I heard you speak. That's awesome.
And there is that kind of almost like an Eastern philosophy, right? Of like, just let it flow, right? And it's kind of interesting how, Jackie has been, we talked about her coach at the beginning, right? The voice coach, the acting coach, whatever you want to call him. And now Jackie has become a coach to her, who is much more sensitive to her own feelings and much more actually useful, right? Because the other coach, of course, didn't actually help. He was turning her into a robot.
Yeah, surface level versus like authentic, and Jackie maybe she's a little older, maybe she's gone through this stuff as well.
That's true.
So
was there something else from here, Vanessa?
No, my next one's not until 304. So this is towards the bottom of the page, after the results are in of the election. And Mariana says, I thought in the end we'd somehow band together and he'd help us, save us. I thought we'd save each other. I think she's still figuring out like how her father works, I think. So she thought like he was going to be willing to help her with all of these changes, I think. But now he's saying that he can't do anything because he didn't win.
Yeah, he's really bitter, right? And then he says, ruined by my own daughter. And yeah, she has this epiphany, right? Where she says at the bottom there, he's not the hero I thought he was. And he kind of tries to rub it in too, right? He's like, well, if I would have won, I would have fixed it. right? But I mean,
and she kind of challenges him, like, well, you still have, like, you can still do something.
yeah, exactly. So that doesn't end well, but the story keeps going, and I had a passage on 315. I like this. Well, first it talks about how they're already seeing the serious impact that this contamination has caused, because apparently the groundwater there contained high levels of pharmaceutical contaminants. And so there was a 5-year-old boy in hospital, and the doctors believe that the boy's heart medication may have reacted poorly over time with the chemicals, right? So, these are real, like, this is now like a real life and death situation, right? It's not a cumulative thing. And then she says at the bottom, I think of all that time Bobby said he'll be spending with his family. I wonder if it'll be days, weeks, or months before he's meeting with donors and constituents again. He can't change who he is. We all know he'd rather be running for president, for senate, or anything. I wonder if now maybe he'll run for me. But I can't wait for him to make a decision before I make my own. I just really like that, because it really shows that she is kind of willing to accept him for who he is, but she's also not going to just follow who he is. Did you all have one after that? Like,
I just have.
Oh, go ahead.
Go.
I was gonna say 322 and
Same.
323.
same
Of course.
Same.
I mean,
I should have
if there's gonna be any
proof.
yeah, ocular proof.
So the one line that I wanted to highlight on 322 is where it says, it's towards the bottom of the page. It says, all I'm sure of is that I want to be the one to choose in my own time. I want to be the one who gets to have her own say. And then I wanted to tie that into a line on 323. She says, I think of the name my parents gave me, Mariana, the sea it holds, the way its power stirs inside me. I run toward it and jump in. And that's the end. I really like that last line, though, because it ties into something at the very beginning, in the first half of the book. And so it kind of like comes full circle.
What did you all think about that end for her?
Well, I love the, first of all, like, again, in terms of writing, the multiple meanings of running that are added, because it turns out she's gonna be running for vice president of Poder. Vice president, of course, because Didier ideally would become president he'd run for president. But then, of course, this idea of running towards who she's going to be. And it says, I run towards it and jump in.
And even like running water.
Yeah, there's still uncertainty for her, right? Because just before that line you read, because that comes out of her parents arguing. She hears them, and she's, as it's mentioned, her and the other kids are doing interviews, and she makes this statement, and of course right away it reminds me of all these other activists that get a lot of ire from politicians. For example, Greta Thunberg. And environmental justice, right? She's young, and you hear the worst from her, but this line that she says at the top of 322, you're supposed to be the adults, I tell the Times. You say you want to leave us a better world, but you're leaving us to clean up after your mess. It's just this very direct claim, and that kind of leads to that argument later where she mentions, or her mother kind of stands up for her, like, don't stop her from becoming the person she wants to be. And Maria, she admits, like, I don't know who that is yet, but I want, like, is the line you read, Vanessa, right? I want to take my time and figure it out who that is. And I think, again, what a beautiful sentiment there at the end of kind of her namesake, right? That power behind it, and optimistic ending, if anything, because it is easy to be cynical in regarding justice, regarding changing the world, especially maybe from the perspective of youth. And looking at the way the world is now, it's very easy to be cynical, but this one leaves us, at least for me, a sign of hope, right? As long as we keep running actively towards it.
Yeah. And what did you all think in terms of how the ending compares to other endings of Zoe's, like a Star in Hate You Give, or June in Patron Saints of Nothing?
I think this one reminds me a little bit more of Poet X. I think.
Why?
Because she well, in Poet X it ends when she's after the open mic, I guess, the poetry slam, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she's kind of like with all of her family, and she sees who she is that way. And Mariana is kind of the same. She sees herself in a different way now after all of like these events.
That's true. And I think it's because she does have Jackie there. I could definitely see as a good sequel here where, she's maybe in college and maybe like she learned a lot more from Jackie, right? Because what was she, like a sophomore or something? And so like in college or maybe even after, like how maybe she doesn't run for office, but maybe like she is just like an activist as big as Jackie is, and kind of carves her own terrain, and it's funny how it kind of all started, with her connecting with her dad in the Everglades, but then ironically, that moment became a way to disconnect from him the more she found out about him and his political views. So I think it's a really relevant story. We have, of course, it's campaign season right now. So many of us are looking to vote. And hopefully we can vote in a way that's safe because of COVID. It's more complicated now. And so a lot of the issues that we see here, right, related to environment and justice, are touched on in this novel. And that's why I really like it.
Since doing this podcast, I mean, we've followed Natalia on social media, and it's really cool to see kids reading these. I think even Grace, her daughter she took a picture of her holding
Yeah.
the book running, and then so I hope that this book can really do something for people, especially the youth that are reading it.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for joining us on this week's episode discussing Running by Natalia Sylvester. And if you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep and on Twitter at literallylitep.